School. I'm pleased to have everybody here to be part of this series. I was just reflecting on when I was a graduate student. We used to go to these types of things regularly, and it was really a wonderful luxury to hear the various research that's going on at the university. So I just want to welcome you all to the Norton School.
And I'd like to give you a welcome from the Francis McClellan Institute. I'm Bea Romero, director. And, you know, our mission there is to improve the lives of children, youth, and families. We are a research institute. And we provide many resources through the Lang Observation Lab and the Lang Analysis Lab. These are free and available to all faculty and students that are here at U of A. And you can get affiliation with the Francis McClellan Institute through our research initiatives, which include focus areas on early childhood, adolescence, Latinx families, and fathers and parenting. And I'd like to, this is just a picture to remind us about our legacy of Francis, who is a great advocate for children, youth, and families. And we're really happy that we can keep her legacy alive and do this good work through the Institute. And we want to say a thank you to Pamela Turbeville, who has provided support for this speaker series. She is a U of A alumni and received the CALS Alumni Achievement Award in 2000. And so we always thank Pamela for that. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to Savannah Boyd, one of our FSHD grad students, to introduce our speaker today.
It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Sbarra. He's a faculty member over in psychology, where he is also the director of clinical training there. He received his PhD at the University of Virginia and went on to complete his residency at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In his lab, Social Connectedness and Health, they work to investigate why romantic relationships are so important for health and the biological and psychological consequences of ending such relationships. He has over 80 publications in this area and has been and is the PI on grants from the National Science Foundation, the NIH, that investigate this topic. So we're really excited to hear his talk.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Oh, I'm supposed to switch it over. Yes. Okay. Switch it. Okay, so I'm really pleased to be here, and in fact, I'm pleased to be back here. When Family Studies and Human Development was in its old building, I gave this lecture, and when Andrea contacted me, I said, you know, I did this already. She was trying to sneak out the back door, and she said, well, you know, that was 15 years ago. Do you have anything else to say? Have you done anything? So I said, okay, I can come back, you know, a victory lap or something. But I was thinking about the first talk last night a bit, and part of it was I think I published all of 2 or 3 studies at the time. And I have a lot more to say now, which means I'm going to speak a lot faster. So I'll try to squeeze everything in and get to as much as I can. But if you have questions, please stop me. It's really great to be here. It's great to have a connection to this department and this wonderful school, and of course, being in this wonderful building. So what am I going to do today? Oh, first I'm going to say thanks. I often sort of go fast enough that I forget. And there are a lot of graduate students who work with me. There are a lot of postdocs that work with me, different funding sources, so and collaborators, some of whom are in the room. So thanks to everyone, and this is really a big team effort, what we're doing. Okay, so start off, I just want to put a relational context on this. I'll talk about divorce today, and talking about a translational science, which is really an intervention science, and a move toward intervention science, and largely focused on the correlational studies that we've done here. But why study close relationships in health? This is meant, you're not really meant to see any of this, but I'm just trying to prove, like, if there were a stack of journals, that they would just go over our head. There's a huge, voluminous literature on close relationships in health. There's a paper that just came out today in Health Psychology about marital quality and death in a very large epidemiological sample. Yet another paper. So in every conceivable way, we have great theory and we have great deep data on this. So close relationships provide a vital context for understanding human health and well-being, a vital social context for understanding human health and well-being. We study divorce, then, because it provides us an excellent model system for understanding stress and coping more generally, and stress and health more generally. So there are times when I'll give versions of this talk that will stay more closely connected to relationship science. I'll talk about basic attachment theory and normative attachment connections, what happens when people end those relationships. Here I'm really focusing on the stress part of the stress and health connection. And just to give you an example of what this model system looks like, this was from a 2011 paper. It was a study, a German panel study of 16,000 people over 12 years, and 700 of whom had gotten divorced. And basically, this is a latent class trajectory group membership of what happens to people when they get divorced. Vast majority of people within a few years' times, in terms of their overall life satisfaction, are characterized as being resilient. People fare well, that's the rule, not the exception. There's, of course, a period of upheaval. Some people improve in their well-being. We wrote a paper on this a couple of years ago. It turns out that especially women who are in very low-quality marriages gain a lot when their marriages end. But there's a whole group of people who have a decreasing well-being, and this is somewhere around 15% of people when you think about 40% of first marriages ending in divorce, around there, depending on what you look at. In absolute numbers, this is a large group of people. So we have this basic model in which there's a period of upheaval, trajectory of adaptation, and trying to understand the psychological variables and sometimes the interpersonal processes that predict who fares well or poorly is the basis of what we're trying to do. Today I'm going to just try to go one step further with you. I've never given this talk. I've never tried to put things together in this kind of way, but to go one step further and think about why now, oh, there's no pointer here. Why now should we ask a question about translational intervention science? Why should we go from bench to bedside, so to speak, and try to do something empirical in terms of preventing poor adaptation? Well, the first question is very practical. If your neighbor is getting divorced, what should she do to help her recovery? To me, that question really matters. Someone comes to you and says, shit is hitting the fan in my life and I don't know what to do. What do you say? What should you reasonably say? This question comes to me a lot because people think I'm like the divorce doctor. And so I guess that's why I'm trying to move towards something empirical here. So part of this is that we know a tremendous amount about the risks conferred by separation and divorce, and I'll talk about some of those to begin with, and the processes associated with good or poor adaptation. We know about some of the mediators, we know about many of the correlates, we don't really know much about the mechanisms of action, and I'll talk about what that means. And that there are a number of frameworks for moving from moderators to mediators to mechanisms, and I'll talk about what one of those are. But basically, this is an NIH stage model of intervention development. It may not be familiar to folks over on this side of campus, but in clinical psychology, we work with it a lot, and it's basically a pentagram of how the cycle of interventions get developed and how we move through this. And right now, in this work, we are effectively at stage 0, which is the basic science research. And it's only been 15 years being at stage 0. So now we're going to go another 15 years here, and then another 15. So I'll be dead somewhere here. But, this is how we're trying to get it started and move toward more intervention kind of work. And behind all of this is a real motivation to try to push on levers of change so I can know experimentally what is driving what. I'm so sick of these stupid correlational studies that I've been doing where I really don't know what is explaining what I think, whether things are explaining what I think they're. Okay, so this is the basis of the talk. This is a 2007 paper in Annual Reviews of Clinical Psychology. It's an incredible paper for many, many different reasons by Alan Kazin. It's very lucid, very clear, mediators and mechanisms of change in therapy research, but has very broad implications beyond therapy research. And the first one is that when you're engaged in intervention science development, you're going to establish main effects and moderators of interest, okay? That's clear enough. You're going to identify putative mediators. What variables, I won't say processes, but maybe processes, explain the relationship between divorce and a poor outcome. And for whom? What goes in the middle? And then you're going to push toward mechanisms. You're going to try to understand, and here in this line of work, there's a critical distinction between a mediator and a mechanism. And this is probably plainly aware to a lot of people here, but the mediator is really just a statistical process that explains the two variables. The mechanism is that which gives rise to the effect. And so if you are thinking about a poor outcome in the context of divorce, what is it that gives rise to the poor outcome? If you're thinking about improvement, what is it that gives rise to the improvement or symptom reduction? And what we ultimately want to do is target those mechanisms and not in some sort of like inflated treatment package. We want to go after them as precisely and with the greatest precision possible. Okay, so that's basically the outline of my talk. Part one is to talk about the work that we've done establishing these basic effects, and this is sort of like playing the hits, what we've done already, and then we'll go into some of the newer stuff here. And so let me just begin. This is a paper that we published in 2011, and some people have heard me talk about it. It's a meta-analysis of all the existing, at the time, all the existing epidemiological studies in the world linking marital status, being married versus being divorced, to risk, heightened risk for all-cause mortality. That's basically risk for early death. And so this had over 6 million people, 147,000 deaths, 700,000 divorces. So really precise estimates in the meta-analysis. Of course, meta-analysis is only as good as the data that goes in. So, it's not infallible, but overall, there's a substantially elevated non-zero risk associated with being divorced relative to being married. And this, you can read this risk hazard as a 23% greater risk at each successive follow-up period. So I'm going to say something that's absolutely unequivocal. As time goes forward, people die. And so what happens is, each time married people die, 23% more of their divorced counterparts die. And that's how you interpret this. There's a moderation by gender here. So men die at a significantly elevated, divorced men die at a significantly elevated rate relative to divorced women, but both of them have that non-zero risk. So this was like, we had done some theory work. We had done some, one of my papers is in here, I think. We had done some basic empirical studies, but this was the meta-analysis that sort of started a lot of the most current work to understand why and what this is all about. Is this effect spurious? Is it real? Do we care about it? And I'll go back and forth between sort of death and physical health biomarkers and depression, and sometimes talk about well-being and distress. So it gets a little muddied and muddled, but if you want some clarity on that, I'm happy to offer it to you. But this is establishing the broad-based effect of interest. Now, one of the things we had done just a little bit earlier, but had gotten us thinking in the background, is that everyone in this room certainly knows that marital status is not at all static. People move into and out of marriages, sometimes have multiple marriages, second marriages have an increased likelihood of divorce. And one of the things that we found in this Charleston Heart Study, it's a 14-year study of risk for death associated with cardiovascular disease in a reasonably sized sample out of Charleston, South Carolina. So here's the survival curve. Now this thing is dead. Here's the stupid kids play with it. Here's the survival curve, and basically everyone starts out there alive, and then they die over time. And what? Oh, your kids are out of here. So what we see in this is that how you actually define people's marital biography really matters for the risk association. And in this paper, the big effect was that if you became divorced and you never remarried, or this is hard with the data, but if you were characterized as divorced in this sample for the entire period we had the data, your risk was significantly elevated. But if you simply looked at whether or not you would ever experience divorce, the risk goes to nil. So the effect, there's something here, oh, there's a little thing. There's something here that is characterizing this group that doesn't characterize this group. Thank you. And the question is, what is it all about? What is the defining features here? And I can't speculate from this particular study, but the key feature of this is that we were clued in that it's not necessarily the experience of divorce per se, it's the process, and that should be obvious, it's the processes that go along with it for some people. And I can head someone off at the pass very early on for the Q&A, because inevitably I get the question of, I am very happily divorced. Are you saying I'm going to die early? And the answer is no, not at all. We have a lot of other data that points in that direction. So it is that an average effect masks certain subpopulations that have an undue effect on the average. So just think basic, methodology and statistics. The average, and this risk hazard is an average effect. It's due to or driven by a particular subset. Who are you? Okay, so in this particular analysis, the analysis for this paper, we were studying major depression. And this is when we started to get into the question of moderation. Who is at greatest risk? So let me set this up for you. Here we're using data from the nationally represented midlife in the United States study at 2 time periods, separated by 10 years. And there's a lot to this paper that I won't talk about, but we were trying to deal with the non-random selection out of marriage as a function of different personality types. If you're married or you're in divorce, you know that personality and how people interact with each other makes a big difference in their degree of happiness. So we were trying to control for third variable explanations that might predict outcomes. So if you did this analysis the sort of standard way, like ANCOVA or something like that, you'd find that there's significantly elevated risk for divorce on depression. But when we do this propensity score matching, we find something different. So here we're looking at the probability of a depressive episode as a function of whether or not people were divorced at the first Midas assessment, and whether or not they, and then moderated by whether or not they became separated or remained married. So in the absence of depression at Midas 1, there is not much of an elevated risk. So we see slightly increased elevation. Depression begets depression, and you get up to somewhere around the point prevalence. But for people who are depressed at Midas 1 and then become divorced in the intervening years, the risk for a depressive episode increases dramatically. And this is not a huge subgroup of people in this analysis. I think there were like maybe around 150 altogether. So you're looking at a small group there with an imprecise estimate. But this is 6 out of those 10 people became depressed. And this is a clinical diagnosis of clinical depression. So there is something about a certain set of people with a certain set of people who become divorced with a certain set of background characteristics are more likely to have these adverse or untoward or ill outcomes over time. The second one had to do, the second sort of moderating finding has to do with expressive writing. And this, I've talked about this paper a lot, but if you haven't seen it before, I want to just show it quickly. So this is one of the only actually experiments that I've done here, and it worked completely the opposite way of how I thought it would, so I got it perhaps a little shy. So we wrote a grant, got funding from the National Institute of Aging to intervene and try to promote adults' adjustment after their divorce by using J.B. Pennebaker's expressive writing paradigm. So we asked people to write about the emotions associated with their divorce on 3 successive days for 20 minutes each day. And there's some very small but non-zero effects linking this paradigm to improved mental health and even physical well-being. They're not huge effects, but they're reliable. And in our expressive writing paradigm, we actually had 2 conditions here. We had a traditional expressive writing and then a narrative expressive writing, which they emoted and then actually tried to put it in the context of a story, create a narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end about their divorce. I say that here. It doesn't matter for this, but it will matter a little later on when we talk about some of the newer stuff. And so in this particular finding, we found no main effect for improvement as a function of expressive writing, either of the expressive writings. But we did find that the effect was moderated by self-reported rumination, so this tendency to go over and over and do this negative self-reflection about how bad you feel and how awful things are. So, and it looked basically like this. High ruminators assigned to expressive writing did worse because, and this is the impact of the event scale, at a 3-month follow-up. So over 90 days, we, depending on who we assigned to expressive writing, we made a group of people worse. We caused these people to have worse outcomes. And, you know, we learn a lot in this process. And in retrospect, this is also going to be quite meaningful, that from moderators to mediators to mechanisms, the way you get from a moderator to a mediator, this is an interaction, is to try to think about the processes that are instantiated in the context of the moderation. So for this, in this context of this moderation, we think that people who have a tendency to be up in their head, when they're assigned to a condition that tells them to emote and be up in your head, do worse. We should have thought of it going there. But there is actually some older literature showing that for high ruminators, expressive writing is beneficial. And the reason it was beneficial, I think we had to deal with these sort of facts in the discussion section of this paper. And what we realized is those were studies done with people who had traumatic or difficult experiences years before, not in the immediate aftermath. So there's some period in which people are maybe uniquely susceptible or may struggle uniquely rather than a decade after that. Okay, so what can I say about part one? I'll just make a very brief summary. So we've established, and you're going to have to trust me that there's more than what's here, we've established that divorce is associated with an increased risk for, well, the mortality effect I did show you, for early death, and that part of the process, part of it is that this aggregate level effect may be moderated, and in particular that the risk for poor adjustment may be carried by a subgroup of people. These people have a tendency to get over in their head, to get up in their head, to get over involved in their experience, and these people also are prone to or have had experiences with depression in the past. So that's really part one. That's what I want to say about that. Now, part two is identify some putative mediators. What are the variables that might go in the middle? So once we had done the work of part one, we jumped right into part two and tried to look at what some of those mediators might be. And this is a paper we just published last year, but it's from the same expressive writing data set. And now we collapsed across expressive writing conditions in this particular paper, and we're looking at why it might be the case that people who get over-involved actually do worse. And in this study, we operationalized psychological over-involvement as a composite scale using a couple of different measures that have pointed us in that direction. One of which, well, there's rumination, there's attachment anxiety goes into that because of the attachment-related hyperactivation. And there's also a variable that we refer to as linguistic or verbal immediacy, which is a style of discourse that is characterized by first-person, present-oriented, short words that is a very here and now way of discussing your experience. And for people who are high in attachment anxiety, people who are high ruminators, they tend to talk about their experience as if it's unfolding right now. And they're engaged in this sort of emotionally hot language when they talk about it. And that's a marker. We've traced that as a marker of over-involvement. So we have this composite, and one of the things that we've shown in this particular paper is we're not great at the temporal precedence side here, but that people who are over-involved have difficulty creating a coherent narrative about their experience. a story that makes sense, is digestible, and that they can metabolize for their improvement. Higher levels of narrative coherence are associated with less distress in time. And so the path, we think one of the paths, goes something like this. That people who, the moderator, the people who are like this in a certain way have the tendency to get over-involved, have difficulty creating a coherent narrative about their experience. And now this is where things just get a little confusing for like 5 minutes, but it's a sociology of science story. So the Sbarra story is that it turns out that in the paper where we wrote that expressive writing was bad, it wasn't all bad. And so I really need to get tenure at this university. I needed to hustle things along. So I published this effect that was, I believe the effect is there, but I missed something important along the way. And it's that the expressive writing effect is strongest in the traditional expressive writing. And there was all kinds of interesting stuff going on in the narrative expressive writing that for that particular analysis didn't show itself, but later on did. So here's a mediation that is itself moderated by group. And here we're just going to focus on the A path of this mediation. And I know you can't see it, so I'll just explain to you what's going on. So this is like what I would call a proof of concept paper. 130 people is not enough to do some mediated moderation analysis and, moderated mediation analysis and to really feel totally confident about this. So, but here's what's going on. From the control condition to the traditional condition to the narrative condition, you're seeing a smaller and smaller effect on the A path. And we didn't test these differences because it's just the sample size is not there. But what effectively, we made the argument, the overall interaction effect is there, and we're making the argument that a narrative expressive writing is attenuating the negative association here. Attenuating a negative association means that in control writing and traditional, you can flip it and say in control writing and in traditional expressive writing, people, the context takes it creates, there is a context in which people who are over-involved tend to get worse and make less narrative. In narrative expressive writing, these people don't show this strong association. So it's a weird kind of logic where you're knocking out an indirect effect that is in a, sort of like the bad thing. Now, why do I have at least a little bit of confidence in this? There's a bigger story to this. And the bigger story is that there's a whopping positive main effect on some of the health markers or some of the markers of autonomic nervous system activity as a function of just narrative expressive writing. So this was another paper one of my graduate students, Kyle Barassa, was the lead author on, and we published it in Psychosomatic Medicine last year. So now what you're doing is, this is just a visualization of heart rate, and this is immediately after the expressive writing. This is 3 months after the expressive writing, and this is 7 or 9 months after the expressive writing. There were 2 groups for reasons I don't want to get into. But the main effect of heart rate is you can see it straight away that the people who are assigned to this condition, and this is an experimental effect, so we reduce the heart rate. Whether or not you think and want to argue if that actually matters for health, we can have that discussion. I'm not convinced that it totally does, but you just have lower heart rate, and this is across every single one of our laboratory conditions. So there's something going on in the narrative expressive writing, and we're seeing this thing that any psychophysiologist who's ever done any work in this area will tell you is a very large dissociation between what people say and the markers of their physiology. So narrative coherence, over-involvement to interrupting narrative coherence. One of the other mediators that we've worked on is this idea of self-concept clarity disruption or self-concept coherence. And there have been a bunch of papers that we've done on this. I'll tell you about one of them. But for the relationship scientists in the room, and many people here probably know that a tremendous amount of how we define who we are as a person, how we define our self-concept, is relational in orientation. I define who I am in relation to the people in my lives. I'm a friend, I'm a parent, I'm a partner, those sorts of things. And when our relationships end, there's a massive upheaval to the self and people's self-concept. And this is one of the ingredients that I think really, really matters in terms of people's adaptation. So I'm going to switch out of study of divorce for 1 second and tell you about an experimental study on romantic breakups. And this was a study we completed here a couple of years ago that was, I think, pretty unique. And one of the pieces here is that we assigned, actually, this is my second experiment. We assigned people almost randomly. There were some problems with the assignment, but basically randomly, to participate in our research on breakup adjustment, or to provide us a very, very minimal dose of measures over a 9-week period. So we basically said, we're going to do some questionnaires at the beginning, and then come back way at the end. And then the other group, the actually experimental group, filled out some questionnaires, had their autonomic psychophysiology recorded, and a series of lab tests, and then made a series of recordings about their breakup experience and how they felt about it and what they thought about it. And sure enough, the actual experimental condition was associated with a whole variety of changes. So here's the interesting part. This is an experiment in the intervention science. It's different in social psychology, but in the intervention science world, there's not much. No one really believes that there's an effect absent an expectation for effect. Right? That I think this intervention will be good for me or something like that. Here we're seeing quite a different thing. We're seeing that participating in this has an effect on improving people's overall adjustment and their sort of self-reported emotional intrusion about their separation, their loneliness, and in fact, the mediator of this is change in self-concept clarity, improvements in self-concept clarity, the degree to which you feel you know yourself. So you can have, or decreases in self-concept disturbance, the degree to which you don't know yourself. And here we've also operationalized the ways people are talking about their experience through those recordings. So, and we have a couple of papers on this now, and showing that you can put self-concept disturbance in the middle, and that this is pretty much ripe as a mediator for change. And one of the earlier studies, again with breakups, was a time-based analysis of this, and what we found was that you seem to feel better because you have reorganized your sense of self. Not that you not that you develop a sense, I couldn't flip it, not that you develop a sense of improved sense of self because you feel better. There's a temporal ordering to these things that really does matter. And so that part I think is very important. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but I think a tremendous part of this with respect to relationship breakups and separations is about routine disruptions. We've really come to think about that, we define who we are as a person in addition to relationally by what we do. And I mean literally, like, what do you do when your feet hit the ground on the bed? Like, how long does it out of bed? How long does it take you to put some coffee in your body? What do when are you brushing your teeth? All the kinds of things that they themselves are relationally oriented. So there's a lot going on here that I really hope to unpack in some other data. Okay. Let me make a little bit of a transition now to talk about things that are more social in nature. And we just finished collecting data, well, a couple of years ago now, we finished collecting data on a project with Matthias Mell and one of my colleagues, Dick Krutzer, who passed away a couple of years ago. And this was a study, it still is a study, of 120 people who immediately followed, 3 months after their marital separation. So many of them are still married, but they stopped physically living together. And we followed them for 5 months. And at months 1, 3, and 5, they wore this electronically activated recorder. And that's what it looks like. It was, at the time, it was on an iTouch device, which was, you know, a tremendous advance over it being a digital tape recorder. But this is, Matthias Mell developed the ear, the electronically activated recorder, and what it effectively does is opens the microphone on the iTouch and records ambient sounds in the environment for 30 seconds every 12 minutes. So what you do is you get a naturalistic sample of what's going on in people's real world life, and then we transcribe it. T-recoders rate the sound snippets for the presence or absence of a variety of files. And so what happens is, over a course of a weekend, you get something like 200 or so files, and then you get an average of percentage of time people are doing certain things. And that actual doing then is the question of whether or not that predicts anything. So how much time are people talking about their ex? Well, not a lot. Not a lot of time, it's 1% of time. That's sort of interesting, by the way, because Matthias has done all this work related to cancer and other sort of life upheavals. Same thing, immediately following adjuvant breast cancer treatment, people are talking about cancer 2% of their time. So life as usual doesn't have a lot of all the crazy stuff to think. How much time are they with their ex? 1% of the time. Well, and this is highly skewed, it turns out, this is actually a very predictive variable, and it predicts their psychological adjustment. And now, last week, we realized that it's also associated with their objectively measured nighttime rest activity, otherwise known as sleep. So you've got to transform this and deal with those kinds of that kind of skewness, but pretty interesting. How much time they spend crying? Almost none. They do spend a good amount of time laughing. That's 8% of their time. And a tremendous amount of time having the TV on, right? That ranges from 0 to 99%. I have no idea. They're not watching TV. The TV's in the background, so we don't know what they're actually doing, but the coders can reliably agree that there is television on. So the question is, what is actually predicted here? And so this is a dissertation study done by one of my former students, Ren Hasselmo. And it's a subsample of people that we drew some blood on. So here we have 55 of those people of the 122. And we took a variety of immune outcomes here, a variety of immune indicators. And we created the immunological risk phenotype, an IRP. And so this is associated with two dimensions of immune functioning. So here are indicators of inflammatory, pro-inflammatory cytokines and systematic C-reactive protein measure of systemic inflammation, and then antibody titers to these two latent viruses. And one way of thinking about this, familiar with the concept of allostatic load, and the way allostatic load basically works is we're taking like an immune arm of allostatic load. So it's a risk marker, and you simply count what the elevations are, and then you get a, some continuous variable that probably has really crappy psychometric properties, but that's what you're working with here in this case. And then we have the ear-assessed social integration and self-reported distress. Social integration is a composite of some of the ear variables, and it's a composite of time spent socializing with other people, time spent receiving positive support. So Savannah, it's okay. That's the positive support. And time spent in substantive conversations. I can't do that right now. And time spent in substantive conversation, we just have a big paper out about that being associated with psychological well-being, where there's meaningful information exchange rather than these surface level kind of conversations. It turns out that, well, psychological distress and social integration are highly correlated. That's good. The psychological distress is not really correlated with this immune risk profile, And then the social integration variable is sort of associated with this. And you can put it all together in a crappy cross-sectional mediation. Right, this is cross-sectional, and I would never ever suggest anyone do this if it was exclusively self-report. So what way do the associations exist? Psychological distress cannot go in the middle here because it's not associated with the IRP. The nice thing about this, in my mind at least, or you can at least convince reviewers this much, is that you have self-reported distress, ear-assessed social integration, and markers of immune distress. So the question is, if you can put social integration in the middle, is there a way in which changes in social integration may give rise to some sort of improvement in a health biomarker? And that's sort of what we're working on now. So there's the indirect effect of those. Okay. I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I'll just sort of give you one little teaser. This is a very little sidebar, but it's pretty interesting. We have, on 48 of those 55 people, we have drawn their blood and then studied chemical changes across their entire genome. And so I really, really don't know what to do with this data, but we have assessed the DNA methylation, so that's chemical change on top of the genome, on 48 people at 450,000 loci. So I have like a very big data set that's like super wide but very short with the number of people. But one of the things you can do with the DNA methylation data, and really if you take nothing away from this slide, just sort of keep this in the back of your mind, is that there's a new biomarker on the scene that is referred to as DNA methylation age or epigenetic acceleration. And you can think about it as a biomarker similar to how you might think of telomeres. So, and one of the things that's interesting here is that I like the metric because you get an age, a variable that is calibrated in actual years. So this is the extent to which your DNA methylation across immune cell loci are accelerated with respect to your actual chronological age versus delayed. So this person out here has a 5-year acceleration. Their methylation of their immune cells is saying they look like someone immunologically 5 years older. And there's an inverse association with the ear social integration variable. So I don't know what the story is here, and it's only 48 people, so I don't think it's super precise. I have no sense, that the base factor 10 is 6, so it's, it's reasonable, but I don't know that it would replicate. But I think all we wanted to do was get the proof of concept that we could do this start to finish in the pipeline, and so this is not uninteresting. So epigenetic clock, the guy here is Steve Fordyce. Okay, part 2.
Can you back up? So I looked all of that, but I think if I was going to go back and say that again, I'm not sure that I understood that. So can you restate the however statement? So the ear social integration negatively associated. So the ear
the higher the social integration, the more protected you are. The less you look.
The more protected, got it.
Yeah, the more protected. Sorry, the inverse. So another way of saying is the lower your social integration, the more years ahead your biology
That makes more
looks.
sense.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just laughing because I had a complete meltdown at a conference on this slide, and I couldn't actually explain the correlation. I was like, just forget it. I don't mind saying that now. Okay, so the mediators are potentially, we talked about this over-involvement and narrative, over-involvement giving rise to narrative coherence, self-concept disturbance and reorganization of the self, and we talked maybe a little bit about social integration and if you could push on social integration. So the last part is really short here, just to push toward mechanisms. There's not a lot of new work. This is a slide we organized to try to put everything together in some kind of heuristic so we know what we're doing. It's a schematic, and the way a lot of schematics are, the important thing we want to illustrate here is there are background individual differences, like trait neuroticism, that predict everything along the way. And you better figure out how to deal with it, or you got a big problem on your hands. It predicts the likelihood of the actual divorce, and there are a lot of them. It's not just neuroticism, it's depression, it's choose your favorite personality dimension, even things like smoking. And then it predicts the health behaviors, your affective responses, your resources. There are a range of health biomarkers, and this leads to who's doing well or poor. One thing I haven't said, and I put it in here, but in retrospect, I probably could have put it back earlier, but I wanted to frame this up to just sort of point out that health behaviors are a critical part of this process. The more time I spend here, not at the U of A, but the more time I spend working in this space, much more interested I am in health behaviors. And this was a paper that we published this year. Again, Kyle Barassa was the lead author, where we have data from the English longitudinal study of aging. So this is a particular sample, it's an epidemiological sample, who were studied over 8 years' time across 4 waves. And this is what is measured when. But, so there are like 9,000 people, I think, or 900 divorces. So the estimates I feel pretty good about. But one of the things that's very interesting in this is that, again, life satisfaction and marital status co-occur. They're at the same time point. So don't think of this exclusively as a temporally ordered process. But we find that marital status is associated with decreased life satisfaction. We don't know when these people got divorced. They could have been divorced in their early 20s, and now they're 63 on average. So life satisfaction is negatively associated with the likelihood of smoking. So high life satisfaction, less likelihood of smoking. But the key thing here is that marital status, the association between marital status and risk for early death 8 years later, that is a robust total effect. So again, we replicate the effect. Good, we should, because there's the epi effect, meta-analytic effect, is entirely explained by smoking status, and that effect is in turn through lung function, decreased lung function. So that's interesting, okay, but this is the 3rd study now where we have found smoking differences between people who are married and not married. And one of the things that I'm sort of trying to figure out how to study is that this part of the equation in this particular analysis is very interesting to me, is in the sense that part of the upheaval is a tremendous amount of stress. And the way people regulate stress and regulate their affect really matters. You can regulate your affect in a way that is good for you, or you can do it in a way that is ultimately bad for you. And for people who are former smokers, the likelihood that they will start smoking again when their marriage ends is very, very high. And so you essentially get one thing you're trying to manage, a problem, if you will, the stress of your divorce, and you put on another problem on top of it. And then my issue is like, how mechanistically do you get to death? Like, what is the actual bridge through some psychology if it's a real effect? And I'm still waiting to decide if I think it's real. But I think it's pretty real. So, meaning like not explained by some other variable. So here's one helpful behavior. All right, let me wrap it up here. We have some candidate mechanisms. So over-involvement to narrative coherence. Can you push on narrative coherence and get people to try to explain, get certain people to try to create a better narrative about their experience, explain what's going on in a more sensible and coherent way? Can you figure out a way to promote self-concept clarity, improve this self-concept? One of the things that we found, actually, in the expressive writing study was that high ruminators who were assigned to the control condition did the best at the 9-month follow-up. So there was something about, and now the control writing was a time use writing. How are you going to spend your time? And so I've been thinking for a long time, there's something about thinking about how you spend your time and actually thinking about how you will spend your time that gets these people out of their head and into their day. And if you're into your day and into your activities, that may be a route to sort of start reorganizing your sense of self and just get you going again. So we're trying to study that. One thing I haven't told you about, we have this whole line of self-compassion, research on self-compassion, the way in which people relate to their own experiences and use or don't use critical self-talk and how harsh they are and where they can locate their experience in the universality of all kinds of human experiences. So that may be one of the levers too. And then social engagement. Can you do anything social? One of the things that we've been dabbling with is actually trying to create a text-based support system for people who are going through divorce and literally just figure out if we can use some of the wonderful undergraduates at this university to be like texting partners for people who are going through a difficult experience. And then you can take the text logs and you have to have some, if you're going to do it experimentally, you have to have some experimental condition, right? So just text freely versus text and try to give support. And then if you can find that with some fidelity, there's some support difference, and that yields some sort of difference, that can be good. Divorce pen pals, yeah. Texting is the new pen pal. And then, the prevention of smoking, which is something that Kyle, for us, is trying to work on. So there are a lot of angles here, and we're just really trying to build them out with new ends and do this. All right, so I'm coming to the end. Lost track of time. But we have clear main effects and established moderators. Do the moderators point to mediators or mechanisms? What is the basis for thinking that you can move through this translational science following these three different ways of thinking about it? The pursuit of the mediators, we talked about what those different ones were and some of the new correlates here for social engagement, measured objectively. And then push towards mechanisms via experimental medicine. The experimental medicine angle is to try to target the behaviors, including thoughts, that you think give rise to the problems or improvement in the problems. So what is it that conveys the effect? What is it people doing or not doing? And how can you target those? There are a whole series of sort of failed intervention efforts, right? So there's a whole series of like social support interventions for people after following cardiovascular, following MI or some sort of cabbage surgery that have failed largely because they're just throwing things at people. And when you throw things at people without any sort of theoretical guide or empirical basis for doing so, I think you're more likely to fail than an approach that at least has some basic science behind it. We're likely to fail anyway too, but that's just the nature of it. So, yeah. I'm done, and thank you again, and that's all I have to say.
So my question is going back to your neighbor. So what's the takeaway for the neighbor? So your neighbor tells you your slide. Your neighbor says that she's divorced. What should I tell her based on your talk? Like, what's the layperson summary of your talk that I can take away and tell my neighbor who's getting divorced?
Okay. First of all, what I have to say, the way I'm going to start my answer is going to sound really ridiculous. Okay. Just trust me. Okay, trust me. The next thing I'm about to say is going to be terrible. Okay. Did anyone hear me on the radio last night? No. Okay, good. So I was on the radio last night, and I answered this question. And I was just going to, I'm glad no one heard, because I'm going to recycle the answer. So I was like, I was on the radio. How stupid does that sound? So, okay, this is a real thing. So when...
or like an airplane, like that comes up on an airplane,
yes.
too.
Well, what happened was it would come up all the time when my kids were in preschool. So after a couple of years at the same preschool, everyone sort of figured out what I did. And then the relationship started ending, and you spend a lot of time with these people, and you're friends with them, and you get taken aside quite often and say, like, my husband had an affair, and our relationship is ending, what should I do? And so I have one instance I was talking about last night, and said, well, what's the issue? And she's like, I'm so jealous. And this was someone who had an affair with a coworker, and she was, so jealous, obviously. And I was like, well, what do you do when you're jealous? Like, what happens when you're jealous? And she's like, I immediately text him. And I like text him because at least I know, hold your ears, at least I know he's not like fucking her if he answers. And I was like, oh, okay. So the angle here is to try to take whatever we know about clinical intervention or something, and you know, obviously you probably would answer the same thing, but my answer was straight from the self-compassion stuff, which is, well, one of the things you need to know about your emotions is that they come and go like waves, and so you center more on the mindfulness end. Your emotions are going to come and go like waves, and you don't have to respond to your emotional experience. And in fact, one of the things that I would say is that in a case where it's an objectively difficult experience and all these kinds of emotions are coming up, you're sort of pouring fire on the flame here. So what you want to do is extinguish that by not being driven by your emotions exclusively. So just let them come up, notice them, anchor in the, you know, so all that kind of stuff. And that's more mindfulness, not necessarily related to divorce, but a whole line of the divorce research is related to self-compassion. And if she said, you know, if she came in with a different kind of question and said, it's 3 months later, I'm still having all these sleep problems, you know, I read your paper on sleep and blood pressure and I'm really worried, right? So, you know, and I would say, well, you know, what kinds of things you're doing during the day and what are the activities that we, so there's a way in which it'll never be exclusively science-based, but there's a big clinical psychology that I can fall back on and give some advice about that. So hopefully there would be enough so that you wouldn't have to have like this kind of background to be able to do that. There would be things where you'd say, these are the things you got to work on, you know, staying active. You got to work on being engaged with your friends. You got to make sure your sleep is good. And half of them will be things we know about stress and health in general, and half will be things that are specific to divorce.
So thinking about like that social support piece, and you know, you did the narrative writing, so sometimes we tell our stories to each other, we don't write them down. So is there a way, you know, I can see where sometimes, you know, you go to your friend and you're just like emotional and maybe they exacerbate it and you just stay in that moment of like the jealousy or whatever, right? Versus if you go to your friend and they walk you through that narrative, like, you know, telling your story and sequence of events, that maybe those are 2 different ways that we can use social support as well to benefit or, you know, make it worse.
I think it's a great idea. I mean, like, the idea is, well, how should you actually support somebody?
How do you
right?
talk with them?
Yeah. I would suspect just sort of like, I might guess that naturally there's an evolution of how we do that in our friend relationships, right? Like that you start off and you're sort of just listening and you're like, okay, you know, who are other people now? You know, like, what, are there anyone? You know, you just start asking that and sometimes, but you could do it more in a more directed way.
The average person is not clinically trained, so
Yeah, but I think
you know, some of those friendships or social, what might be seen as social support might exacerbate.
Oh,
right?
that is it.
Make it worse. Like you go to your girlfriend, you're like, oh my God, I'm so mad, and she's like, yeah, you have reason. He's awful. Like, you know, it can make it worse.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. And I think people who have the tendency to make it worse, they end up in situations that do make it worse. So they're, see what others do. Yeah. Maybe.
I was also thinking about the social support component. So when your friend comes to you, I think a lot of it is like, you have the advantage of work with adults and kind of turning it around and be like, what would help you the most right now? Like, what do you want? Like, asking what support is preferred by the person is really important, because even if you try to give support, if it's not perceived or if it's not the type that's wanted anyway, then it's futile. So just kind of turning it around and asking them. People aren't always accurate, but just what would help her most in that moment.
I think that's good. I think that, I mean, I can think of examples, though, like really specific examples where people don't want, they don't want to hear anything that might actually be associated with improving things, right? Like, don't tell me I should do something. I just remember one time in particular, this mom and this daughter in therapy, and the daughter had a very specific way her mom could listen to her. And she was like, I don't want you to tell me anything to do. I don't want you, and she was just like, long listen, and the mom was like, see, this is what I'm dealing with, you know?
Has your research even stemmed into the effects on the children after divorce? That would be interesting. Like,
Yes,
to hear
that's,
about. Do they affect them even worse in a way than the marital mortality compared to the children who actually, I think, deal with more of the emotional?
No, it turns out no. So that's the background. The lab from whence I came, it was studied the effects of parent conflict on kids, and very much started off with the study of divorce, and started off with the study of divorce on kids, and then moved into the effects of co-parenting conflict, and then efforts to remedy the co-parenting conflict. So I moved out of that literature in terms of the work that I do. We don't really study the kids. We should study the kids, or at least we should study more about how the kids are involved. The story about the kids is probably pretty similar in terms of, like, there is an average, the modal response is one that is highly resilient. There is a period of upheaval. There are some subclinical kinds of experiences that persist for a long time, like not having the kind of childhood you wanted, feeling disappointed about the way your parents' relationship was. But it looks like the specific indicators of clinical problems are probably pretty minimal, except in the most acrimonious relationships.
This is more of a technical question about one of the methodologies you used in regard to the recording device, right? And I didn't quite, maybe it wasn't as specific as I'm thinking, but I'm just imagining getting that through IRB. So, you know, whenever you record anything, it seems to be a sticky matter with IRB, but that seemed to be recording sort of anybody anywhere. Is that the case? And were there considerations about that? You know, strangers just coming up and their voices are being recorded.
I am not the developer of the ear, and I am not the one who pushed it through the U of A IRB. So Matthias Mel can give you the answers with that. But what I can tell you is there's some specific parameters around this. This is a no consent state. So you can record anyone you want whenever you want without their consent. So in some states, you cannot use the ear because it requires consent to record. So one of the things that we do is people wear the ear externally, and there was like one of those orange triangles on it. So when people would ask, we just gave them a script saying, you know, this is a recording device I'm wearing as part of a study. But also the key thing about it is they wore it on the weekends, not during the work week in which they're, so you might have a very different kind of profile, but if you wear it during the work week. But Matthias has got all kinds of studies now where they're doing it in the workplace, and he actually had one here where he had it on professors in the workplace during the work week. So I think a big part of it all starts with the umbrella of, like, you don't have to give consent in this state. So whether or not that's duplicitous or not, I mean, is really a point of discussion.
I think they give it, participants have the opportunity to listen to all the files and delete any of them prior to giving it over to the research team. And sometimes they do. And I think they also delete anything where there's another recognizable other
that's
person.
what I was wondering, just if
And they
anything was
delete those files
identifiable.
Yeah.
Another person.
But not in our studies. They had that option. They didn't delete that many files, and we don't delete other people. Like if there's a recognizable person, like Emily Butler just came, cheers for, you know, maybe we delete that, but I don't recall that being a thing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but if the X was there, they need that file to determine that they're with the X. Right.
Yeah. So obviously they collect even more latitude.
And how do you determine if they're with the X? I don't know.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure either still. It's by the inferential context of what's going on. Like, I haven't seen you in so long, I'm here to get the kids, yeah, you know, then they can, but there's something. Well, hardly, not
There's expletives, that's what you're saying, expletives?
There's not much of that, but one of the things that, it's that the judges, say we're the judges can agree. Whatever it is, the judges are agreeing on it. And they're agreeing at file by file level. That's pretty neat.
It is.
And I was thinking back to how I tried to relation psychology, or just?
We haven't really studied would be like the best honors thesis. But it's basically done. All you have to do is do a couple of correlations. So it's just, we haven't looked at it and really tried to understand what's going on with it. But I almost gagged this one time I was at a meeting, and this guy, Andrew Steptoe, who's a very well-known person in health psychology, was talking, he's like, if only there was a way to measure TV watching, because he's like, I think having the TV on is like just such a marker of social withdrawal. And I was like, oh my God, we have that data. So you could get at that, and there would be a lot of different ways.
Don't Americans watch a lot of TV on average? I feel like the few or TV. I mean, TV. I feel like the calm people like know these statistics and do this research. Because I feel like you hear the numbers and you're like, how can you, on average, watch? Right? It doesn't mean you're necessarily engaged with it, but it's on. Like, I think it's actually higher than people think. So maybe those numbers are more normed given the greater American average of TV being on. I think it's higher than people
Right,
think.
so if it is the case, then you have what would that be? Basically a ceiling effect. Because if the vast majority of the people come home and turn the TV on, and that's what, you're washing out some of the variance associated with any sort of social withdrawal, right? That would be hard to see. And that's what I think was going on when I looked at it very briefly.
And I also wonder, like, if you're a parent and you have the TV on for your kids or your grandkids or the kids who have come over, like, is it TV for you or could it be for your children? Do you all know?
Black box, I don't know there.
Maybe that would be a good indicator of divorce.
If the TV's on longer?
The quality of the time that you're spending with the partner.
Was that?
No, that was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I don't know. We don't have it going in. We don't have it going in, yeah.
Unless it's co-viewed. Like, I know some of the comm folks have, like, co-viewing. It's co-viewing of, like, TV or, like, other, like, now that everyone watches TV, like, they always remind me, like, who has a TV anymore? Like, maybe you're watching on your computer, maybe you're watching on your device. So, but there was some research showing that co-viewing is actually good for romantic relationships.
Yeah.
And there's the same thing in the childhood.
Oh, yeah? So your
Viewing with
parents
the
and
child
children are
versus
watching it
just
together.
having the TV on.
And then, I mean, not to get into like all those other details, but like again, over in the comm department, like Chris Egan, for example, has that great study where they find that like individuals who watch certain kinds of TV, like romantic television, like The Bachelor, they have much worse relationships in terms of like higher divorce rates and cohabitation breakup because they have idealized versions of what romantic relationships are like. Like, take me to Hawaii and let's swim under this waterfall as my first date. Like, that's the study. Right? So, pretty much, other people have replicated that. Right? So maybe it's co-viewing, but maybe it's the type of programming. Or maybe you're like, we don't have the data for sort of cops. I don't know.
That's so interesting.
So I was curious about the cigarette smoking piece of it, and wondering if you have also looked at alcohol use that might be happening at the same time with the cigarette smoking.
We have alcohol in a lot of the big data sets that we have, but we don't see, I haven't seen a lot yet for it. So I imagine that it could be there. And you're dealing with a whole sort of host of smoking behaviors that are also difficult to track now, like less people are smoking, but more people are smoking e-cigarettes, and there's the dual thing and all that kind of stuff that's hard to study. So, but I imagine that self-medication through alcohol would be a very big one. The problem with the studies is that they don't have like the temporal resolution you want. They have the number of divorces you want, but they don't have the like resolution on like when they're drinking. I suspect a lot of
I was
more
just wondering if it was
drinking.
like really comorbid, like you're smoking, and often when you're smoking, you're also in situations where there might be alcohol or other substances. And it's that confluence of all those things that's contributing, like over time, to earlier mortality.
Yeah, I would think that.
Have you ever thought of manipulating the narrative into a more positive aspect, especially for people that are moving, kind of manipulating them to thinking about like the positive things that they learned about divorce and possibly predicting better health outcomes for those people that attention?
Yeah, I think it would be great. The problem is that I really haven't been, you need to be able to get, you need funds for it. You can't, I mean, and maybe we could start with undergraduates who have breakups, but even those people you need funds for. So it's just been hard to be on the grant trail and get that money, but I think and there are versions of expressive writing like that. I mean, you know, some of what we were trying to do for the people who are highly over-involved was really push on the narrative piece in another grant. We just didn't get it funded. So I think there are a lot of good ideas that you could run with. It's just hard to bring them all the way to fruition.
Just illuminated final points. So I think it will be quite interesting to analyze the pattern of narrative. Maybe people start with negative part because it was as a large loss and people need some time to express the negative feelings. But as time passed, they may find some positive aspects and then get better.
Don't you have a study that shows that? It's like in the 237 book, right? The Sbarra study, Sbarra 2005.
Yeah.
It shows the over time, right? It's like they're like, what are we talking about? Dave's right here.
That's what she's talking about. That's not changing the narrative.
Isn't it like, but it's not changing narrative, but it's change over time, right? Like, Adam knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, there are a lot of studies like that. There are a bunch of, you know, there's breakup adjustment studies, there's time to emotional recovery.
So is that always true? Like time, is it like time heals all wounds? Is that true?
There's a paper that says time does not heal all wounds, but not one of my papers, but about divorce. But I was just trying to think, like, you could take they have 3 writing days, and you could create a little slope of the expressed positive affect within those writing days. Someone could go back and do it. I'm not have the energy for that data anymore. But if that's something that's interest, I would be happy to talk to anyone about it, because you definitely could. We tried all kinds of different ways with it, but that is something that would make a lot of sense.
So I'm going to go ahead and end on that note, just to be mindful of our time and remind you guys that Dr. Sbarra is one of our FSHC affiliated faculty, so he's definitely somebody you can call on, and clearly he has data. So thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.